The Maitama night was thick with the scent of rain and expensive exhaust. But inside the restaurant, the air was filtered, chilled, and smelt faintly of vanilla and indifference. Aria sat at the center table, the power table, shrouded in a gown of midnight blue silk that had cost more than some people made in a year. The fabric clung to her curves like a second skin, its intricate beadwork catching the light of the crystal chandelier above. She looked every bit the billionaire's wife, polished, expensive, and utterly hollow. On the table, a single candle flickered between two untouched settings. She had arrived at 7 p.m. It was now 9:45 p.m. The waitstaff moved like shadows around her, their glances a painful mixture of professional courtesy and stinging pity. They knew. In Abuja's high society circles, silence was a currency, but gossip was the bloodline. Every time the heavy oak doors swung open, Aria's heart performed a jagged, hopeful dance, only to settle back into a dull ache when the newcomer was never Zane. She picked up her crystal water glass, the condensation chilling her palm. Her wedding ring, a 10-carat diamond that felt like a lead weight, clinked against the glass. For 730 days, she had worn this ring like a badge of honor. For 730 days, she had been Zane Balogun's shadow, the silent partner in a marriage that existed only on paper and in the flashbulbs of the paparazzi. "Would you like to order, madam?" the waiter asked, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't look her in the eye. He knew the answer. "Just 5 more minutes," Aria replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. It was the 3rd time she had said it. She reached for her phone, intending to check the time again, but her thumb hovered over the Instagram icon. A notification from a popular Nigerian gossip blog had been sitting there for 20 minutes, a digital ticking bomb. With a deep breath that tasted of salt and expensive perfume, she tapped it. The image was grainy, taken in the dim, neon-pulsing heat of a high-end club in Victoria Island. Even blurred, she would recognize that silhouette anywhere. Zane. He was leaning against a velvet booth, his signature cold expression softened by a glass of amber liquid in one hand. Beside him, draped over his shoulder like a silk scarf, was a woman with long, bone-straight hair and a predatory smile. The caption was a barbed wire of blind item hints. Which billionaire ice king is celebrating his anniversary with a bottle of Ace of Spades and an old flame in Lagos while his trophy wife waits in Abuja? The old flame was Maya. It was always Maya. Aria didn't drop the phone. She didn't scream. Instead, she felt a strange, terrifying sense of clarity. The 2 years of cold treatment, the separate bedrooms, the conversations that never went beyond the weather or the next corporate gala, the way he looked through her as if she were made of glass, all of it solidified into a single sharp point of reality. She wasn't just unloved, she was a placeholder in a life he never intended to share with her. She looked at the empty chair across from her. She had spent weeks planning this. She had bought him a vintage watch, a piece of history to match his empire. She had imagined, perhaps foolishly, that on their 2nd anniversary, the ice might finally crack. She thought that if she was beautiful enough, silent enough, and supportive enough, he would finally see her. But Zane Balogun didn't want to see her. He wanted to own her, keep her in a climate-controlled room like a piece of fine art, and only take her out when the world was watching. Aria stood up. The movement was slow and graceful, the silk of her dress whispering against the carpet. She didn't wait for the bill. Her husband's name was on the account, a gold-plated guarantee of payment. She walked past the rows of diners, past the whispering elite of Abuja, and out into the humid night. The valet rushed forward, but she waved him off. She didn't want the chauffeured car. She didn't want the security detail. For the first time in 2 years, The coldness didn't make her shiver, it made her feel alive. She looked down at the ring on her finger, the light of the street lamps dancing off its facets. It was a beautiful prison, but she was finished being the captive. As the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, Aria took a deep breath of petrichor and turned toward the dark street. Zane was obsessed with his empire, his reputation, and his ghosts. He had spent 2 years ignoring her, convinced she would always be there waiting in the shadows of his mansion. He was about to find out how loud silence could be when the person who kept it finally walked away. The master bedroom of the Balogun mansion was a masterpiece of minimalist luxury, all grey marble, brushed steel, and recessed lighting. But to Aria, it felt like a walk-in freezer. She lay on her side of the expansive king-size bed, the silk sheets smooth and mocking against her skin. She didn't turn on the lights. She didn't need to. She had memorized the shadows of this room over 730 restless nights. The digital clock on the bedside table glowed a soft neon blue, 2:14 a.m. Outside, the heavy thrum of a high-performance engine vibrated through the floorboards, followed by the muffled thud of a car door. Aria's heart, despite her resolve, tightened. She heard the front door chime and the heavy, rhythmic tread of Zane's footsteps on the grand staircase. He didn't try to be quiet. He never did. He moved through the house with the absolute certainty of a man who owned everything his shadow touched. The bedroom door creaked open. A sliver of light from the hallway cut across the rug, momentarily illuminating the midnight blue dress Aria had discarded on a chair, a crumpled ghost of her evening. Zane didn't look toward the bed. He moved straight to the dressing room, unbuttoning his charcoal suit jacket as he went. Aria watched him through half-closed eyes, the silhouette of his broad shoulders framed by the doorway. He looked exhausted, but even his fatigue had a sharp, dangerous edge to it. He moved with a cold efficiency, his movements mechanical and devoid of the warmth one might expect when returning to a spouse. "You're awake," he said. It wasn't a question or a greeting. It was a flat observation, his voice deep and raspy from a night of scotch and shouting over club music. "I am," Aria replied. Her voice felt thin in the vastness of the room. Zane emerged from the dressing room a few minutes later, stripped down to his black silk boxers. He sat on the edge of the bed, his back to her, and rubbed the back of his neck. The scent of wood smoke, expensive cologne, and the faint, lingering floral perfume of another woman drifted toward her. It was a scent that didn't belong to Aria, and it felt like a physical slap in the dark. "The board is breathing down my neck about the merger. The Lagos office is a mess, and the investors are getting twitchy. It's been a draining, stressful day. I don't think I've sat down for a meal since 6 this morning." Aria stared at the back of his head, at the perfectly trimmed hair at his nape. She thought of the anniversary table she had sat at for nearly 3 hours. She thought of the vintage watch currently sitting in its velvet box in her nightstand, a gift for a man who didn't even remember what day it was. "I'm sure it was very difficult for you," she said, her tone carefully neutral. He sighed, a heavy, impatient sound. "Don't start with the sarcasm, Aria. I'm too tired for it. Just make sure the staff has my suit pressed for the 8 a.m. meeting. I have to head back to the office early." He climbed into the bed, the mattress shifting under his weight. He didn't reach for her. He didn't brush his hand against her shoulder or offer a perfunctory kiss on the cheek. He simply turned his back to her, pulling the duvet up, creating a literal wall of fabric between them. The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized by the things left unsaid. For 2 years, Aria had filled this silence with her own excuses for him. He's building a legacy. He's protecting us. He's just not a man of words. But tonight, the excuses had run dry. "Did you remember what today was, Zane?" she asked quietly. There was a long pause. She could tell by the change in his breathing that he wasn't asleep, but he didn't turn around. It's Tuesday, he said finally, his voice muffled by the pillow. Why? Did we have a dinner with the minister tonight? If I missed a social obligation, tell my secretary to send flowers tomorrow. No social obligation, Aria whispered to the darkness. Just flowers. Good, then let me sleep. Within minutes, his breathing evened out into the deep, steady rhythm of the truly indifferent. Aria lay perfectly still, staring at the moonlight reflecting on the polished marble floor. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were hovering over the bed, watching this tableau of a failed union. He had treated her like a roommate, a convenient, quiet fixture of his home life, while he handled the aesthetics of his existence while he lived his real life elsewhere. He hadn't asked how her day was. He hadn't noticed the red rims of her eyes or the fact that she hadn't touched the dinner she had prepared for herself. To him, she was a ghost he had become accustomed to living with. Aria reached out, her fingers hovering just an inch above his arm, feeling the heat radiating from his skin. She remembered when she used to crave that heat. Now, it just felt like a reminder of how far away he really was. She withdrew her hand, clutching it to her chest. She wasn't a roommate, she wasn't a trophy, and she was tired of being a ghost. The bed was cold, despite his presence, and as she closed her eyes, Aria didn't pray for him to change anymore. She didn't pray for him to love her. She simply waited for the sun to rise so she could begin the process of disappearing for real. The Transcorp Hilton Ballroom was a sea of shimmering gold and obsidian, a masterclass in Nigerian opulence that screamed of power and oil money. Aria stood at the entrance, her hand tucked into the crook of Zane's arm. She could feel the hard muscle of his forearm through the fine wool of his tuxedo, but there was no warmth in the contact. It was purely structural. Smile, Aria, Zane murmured, his lips barely moving as they stepped onto the red carpet. The board members are watching, and the press is looking for a crack in the foundation. Don't give them one. Aria obeyed. She tilted her head toward him, her face illuminating with a radiant, practiced joy that reached everywhere but her eyes. To the cameras, she was the jewel of the Balogun crown, sophisticated, loyal, and blissfully happy. Zane played his part with terrifying precision. He leaned in close, whispering into her ear as if sharing an intimate secret, though he was actually reciting the names of the stakeholders they needed to impress. He placed a possessive hand on the small of her back, his thumb tracing a slow, rhythmic circle that would have made any other woman swoon. You look breathtaking tonight, he told her loudly enough for a nearby journalist to overhear. He even paused to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering just long enough for the shutters to click. For a fleeting second, Aria allowed herself to wonder if any of it was real. Perhaps the coldness of the previous night had been a nightmare. Perhaps, under the glare of the spotlights, he had finally remembered who she was. Then they stepped through the heavy double doors and into the private VIP lounge where the cameras weren't allowed. The transition was instantaneous. The second the heavy doors muffled the sound of the flashbulbs, Zane's hand dropped from her waist as if she had suddenly turned into burning coals. He didn't just let go. He recoiled, his body language shifting from devoted husband to detached CEO in the span of a heartbeat. Stay in this section, Aria, he said, his voice stripped of the honeyed tone he'd used seconds ago. He began adjusting his cufflinks, his eyes already scanning the room for the Minister of Finance. We haven't spoken since this morning. I thought tonight we might actually... Tonight is about the merger, Aria, not us, he snapped, finally looking at her. His eyes were like polished flint, beautiful, expensive, and incapable of heat. He walked away without waiting for a response, leaving her standing in the center of the room like a discarded prop. Aria watched him navigate the crowd. He was magnetic, his presence commanding the attention of every person in the room. He laughed at a joke from a director, clapped an old colleague on the shoulder, and radiated a charm he seemingly reserved for everyone except the woman who shared his name. Aria retreated to a corner, a glass of Veuve Clicquot held tightly in her hand. She watched the public charade from a distance. Every time a photographer was ushered into the VIP area for a candid shot, Zane would find her. He would appear at her side within seconds, his arms snaking around her waist, his smile returning with blinding intensity. He would toast to her beauty, call her his rock, and play the role of the obsessed lover until the lens cap was replaced. The moment the photographer turned away, he would drop her hand like it was lead. The whiplash was becoming unbearable. It was the cruelty of the hope that hurt the most, the way he could simulate affection so perfectly that she almost believed it, only to have it snatched away the moment the audience disappeared. By midnight, the air in the ballroom felt thin. Aria found herself standing near a floral arrangement of white orchids, her feet aching in her stilettos, but her heart aching far worse. She saw Zane near the bar, leaning close to a woman in a daring red dress. It wasn't Maya this time, but the energy was the same. The easy, fluid attention he gave to strangers while he starved his wife of a single kind word. I realized then that this was the balance Zane had created for their life. He gave the world the image of a perfect marriage to keep the stocks high and the family reputation pristine. In exchange, he expected her to accept the hollow, freezing reality of their private life. He wanted the prestige of a wife without the responsibility of a partner. As Zane walked toward her again, sensing another socialite approaching for a greeting, Aria saw his hand reaching out to reclaim her waist for the next performance. This time, she stepped back just before he could touch her. Zane's eyes flashed with a brief, sharp flicker of annoyance. Aria, he warned under his breath, his perfect husband smile already beginning to form for the approaching guests. Keep it together. I'm tired, Zane, she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of 2 years of acting. We leave when I say we leave, he countered, his voice a low, dangerous velvet. Now give me your hand. He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and unyielding. To the passing couple, they looked like a husband gently leading his wife to the dance floor. But as his fingers squeezed hers, Aria felt only the cold, crushing weight of the leaden silence that awaited them back at the mansion. The performance was flawless. The audience was captivated. But as the music swelled, Aria looked at the man holding her and realized she was dancing with his statue. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the breakfast nook, but it brought no warmth to the glass table where the atmosphere was already sub-zero. Chief Mrs. Balogun sat at the head of the table, her gele wrapped with the precision of a crown and her lace buba stiff with starch and arrogance. She didn't drink the tea Aria had carefully prepared. She simply stared at it as if the steam held an insult. Zane sat opposite his mother, his eyes glued to his tablet, scrolling through market trends and international trade news. He was physically present, but as usual, his spirit was miles away, locked in a boardroom in London or New York. This house is too quiet, Zane, his mother began. Her voice a sharp, cultured rasp that cut through the silence. She didn't look at her son. Her piercing gaze was fixed squarely on Aria, who sat at the edge of her seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. A home of this size should be vibrating with the footsteps of children. 2 years, and yet my son returns to a silent tomb every night. It is little wonder he spends his evenings elsewhere. Aria felt the blood drain her face. The elsewhere was a jagged reminder of the club photos and the late nights. She looked instinctively towards Zane, waiting for the deflection, the defense, or even a simple request for his mother to change the subject. Zane didn't even blink. He swiped to the next page of his report. The economy is volatile, mother. Children are a distraction I don't have time for right now. A distraction for you, perhaps, the elder woman countered, leaning forward until her gold jewelry at her neck clinked. But for a wife, it is her primary occupation. If a woman cannot provide an heir, she must at least provide a reason for her husband to stay home. Tell me, Aria, what do you do all day while my son builds an empire? You sit among your paints and your canvases, playing at being an artist, while your marriage rots from neglect. I am trying, Ma, Aria whispered, her throat tight. Zane is very busy and I try to support. Support? His mother laughed, a dry, mocking sound. You are a ghost in this house. Look at you. You have grown thin and pale. You lack the fire that a Balogun man requires. If you are woman enough to command his attention, he wouldn't be seeking it in the arms of those Lagos socialites. A man is a reflection of the home his wife builds. If he is wondering, it is because the home you have built is cold. The injustice of it felt like a physical weight on her chest. She was the one keeping the home. She was the one who kept his secrets and maintained his public image. She was the one who lived in the freezer he had created. Zane, Aria said, her voice trembling as she looked at her husband. Please. It was a plea for a single word of solidarity. A simple, that's enough, mother, would have been enough to keep her heart beating for another month. Zane finally looked up, but not at Aria. He checked his watch and pushed his chair back, the screech of wood against marble sounding like a final bell. I have a meeting at the Ministry of Works. Mother, don't stay too long. The Lagos traffic will be a nightmare this afternoon. He stood up, adjusted his tie in the reflection of the buffet mirror, and picked up his briefcase. He didn't look at Aria. He didn't acknowledge the venom his mother had just spat across the table. To him, the conflict was just another distraction beneath his pay grade. Zane, are you leaving? His mother asked, her tone softening only for him. I have work to do, he said shortly. He walked to the head of the table, bent down, and kissed his mother's cheek. As he passed Aria, he paused for a fraction of a second. She held her breath, hoping for a touch on the shoulder, a private look of apology, or even a stern command to ignore the old woman. Instead, he spoke without looking down. Try to be more hospitable, Aria. My mother only wants what is best for the family name. With that, he was gone. The heavy front door thudded shut, leaving the two women in a silence that was now charged with triumph on one side and utter devastation on the other. Mrs. Balogun picked up her teacup then, taking a slow, victorious sip. You see, even he is bored with your silence. You are a decoration that has lost its luster. Aria, if you don't find a way to become relevant to his life, don't be surprised when the Balogun family finds a replacement who can actually do the job. Aria sat frozen as her mother-in-law continued to dissect her flaws, each word a fresh sting. She realized then that she was completely alone. In this sprawling, expensive mansion, she was surrounded by gold and marble, but she was unprotected. The man who had promised to cherish her was the same man who stood by and watched her bleed, too busy with his empire to notice that his wife was dying in the seat next to him. She looked at her untouched plate, the food as cold as the man who had just walked out. The cold treatment wasn't just coming from Zane anymore, it was the very air she breathed. And for the first time, Aria didn't feel like crying. She felt a flicker of something else, a small, dark ember of realization that if no one was going to defend her, she would eventually have to stop being the victim. The silence following Mrs. Balogun's departure was more than just the absence of sound. It was a physical pressure, a vacuum that threatened to collapse Aria's lungs. She wandered through the vast hollow corridors of the mansion, her footsteps echoing off the polished stone like a ticking clock in a tomb. For 2 years, she had moved through these rooms with the careful grace of a museum curator, terrified of leaving a smudge on Zane's perfect life. She found herself at the heavy door leading to the basement. It was a space Zane rarely visited, a subterranean vault intended for wine storage and extra furniture that didn't fit his minimalist aesthetic. The air grew cooler as she descended the stairs, smelling of damp concrete and forgotten things. In the furthest corner, tucked behind a stack of imported Italian leather chairs that Zane had decided were too busy, sat a collection of large rectangular shapes draped in grey industrial sheets. Aria reached out, her fingers trembling as she gripped the edge of the fabric. With a sharp tug, she pulled the sheet away. A cloud of dust billowed into the air, dancing in the dim yellow light of the single overhead bulb. Beneath the dust lay her life. There were canvases filled with the vibrant, chaotic colors of a Lagos market at sunset, portraits of street vendors with eyes that held centuries of wisdom, and abstract explosions of gold and crimson that she had painted when she still believed the world was an open door. These were the pieces she had brought into the marriage back when she was Aria the artist, before she became Mrs. Balogun, the trophy. She reached out and traced the edge of a landscape. Her finger left a long, clean trail in the thick layer of grey silt. The dust was heavy, kicked into the textures of the oil paints, suffocating the brilliance she had once poured onto the canvas. Just like me, she thought. She stood there for a long time, surrounded by the ghosts of her own talent. She remembered the girl who had painted these. That girl had stayed up until dawn, her hands stained with cobalt blue and her heart racing with the thrill of creation. That girl had been loud. She had been messy. She had been full of opinions and dreams that had nothing to do with mergers or silk galas. And most of all, that girl had laughed. Aria closed her eyes, trying to summon the memory of her own laughter. She searched through the last 730 days, flipping through the mental calendar of her marriage like a desperate woman looking for a misplaced key. She found smiles, thousands of them. She found the polite, curated smile for the cameras. She found the tight, diplomatic smile for her business partners. She found the weary, submissive smile for her mother-in-law. But as she dug deeper, she realized with a jolt in horror that she couldn't remember the last time she had laughed until her sides ached. She couldn't remember a single moment in this house where joy had been a spontaneous, uncontrollable thing. Zane hadn't just taken her time, he had taken her vibration. He had demanded a version of her that was so still, so quiet, and so composed that the Aria that lived in these paintings had simply withered away from lack of light. She looked at a painting of a young girl dancing in the rain, the brushstrokes wide and joyful. She remembered the day she painted it, singing along to a cracked radio in her old studio, her soul feeling as vast as the Atlantic. Now she felt like a bird in a gilded cage who had forgotten to sing because the master only liked the look of her feathers. A sudden sharp anger flared in her chest, a heat she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the searing rage of a woman scorned, it was the cold, hard resolve of a woman who had just seen her own corpse. She looked at her hands. Clean, manicured, and useless. She hated them. She hated the expensive diamond that weighed down her left hand, a beautiful shackle that kept her tied to a man who looked at her and saw nothing but a piece of furniture. Aria grabbed a rag from a nearby workbench and began to wipe the dust off her largest canvas. She rubbed frantically, her breathing coming in ragged gasps as the vivid reds and deep indigos began to peek through the grey. She didn't care about the dust on her expensive silk blouse. She didn't care about the smudge of grime on her cheek. As the image of a burning Nigerian sun emerged from beneath the dirt, Aria let out a sound, a jagged, choked sob that broke the silence of the basement. It wasn't laughter yet, but it was a sound. It was a sign of life. She realized then that Zane's cold treatment only worked if she remained frozen. If she started to burn again, the ice would have to melt or it would have to break. She stood back, looking at her work. She looked at the dust on the floor and the smudge on her hands. For the first time in 2 years, the mansion didn't feel like a home or even a prison. It felt like a stage. And she was finished playing the role of the invisible woman. She didn't put the sheet back over the paintings. She left them uncovered, their bright, defiant colors screaming against the grey concrete walls. As Zane walked back up the stairs, her spine was straighter than it had been since her wedding day. Zane would be home in a few hours. He would expect the ghost. He would expect the silence. He had no idea that in the darkness of the basement, the invisible artist had just found her eyes. The perfume of the basement, dust, linseed oil, and old dreams still clung to Aria's skin as she entered the master suite. The air conditioning was humming at its usual clinical temperature, a sharp contrast to the fire beginning to kindle in her chest. Zane was in the shower. The rhythmic hiss of the water was the only sound in the cavernous room. She walked toward the nightstand to place her book down when his phone buzzed. Usually, Aria ignored his devices. She respected his privacy with a devotion that bordered on saintly, partly because she was afraid of what she might find, and partly because she didn't want to give him a reason to look at her with even more suspicion. But tonight, the woman who had found her soul in the basement was no longer afraid. The phone screen lit up, casting a clinical white glow against the dark wood. It was a WhatsApp notification. No name was saved, only a string of numbers that Aria had seen on his call logs months ago, numbers she had memorized in the quiet hours of her loneliness. "Thank you for the lovely night, Zane," the message read. It felt just like old times. "Don't let the Ice Queen keep you on too tight a leash tomorrow. See you soon. M." Aria stood frozen, the words searing themselves into her retinas. The lovely night. While she had sat in a midnight blue gown at a table for two in Abuja, he had been in Lagos, reclaiming old times with Maya. While she had been a distraction and a disappointment to her mother, he had been finding solace in the woman he claimed was a closed chapter of his past. She waited for the tears. She waited for the familiar, crushing weight of heartbreak to buckle her knees and send her sobbing into the silk pillows. But the tears didn't come. Instead, a profound glacial stillness settled over her. The heat of the basement transformed into a diamond-hard coldness that surpassed even Zane's legendary indifference. It was the clarity of a woman who had finally reached the end of a long, dark tunnel and found that the exit led to a cliff. The shower stopped. Aria watched the phone screen go black, her reflection staring back at her in the dark glass. She looked different. The soft, pleading light in her eyes had been extinguished, replaced with a gaze as sharp as a scalpel. Zane walked out of the bathroom, a towel wrapped around his waist, steam clinging to his bronze skin. He looked at her, then at his phone, then back at her. He didn't offer a smile. He didn't ask why she was standing in the dark. "I have to fly back to Lagos for an emergency board meeting in the morning. Pack a small bag for me. I'll be gone for 3 days." Aria looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the man she had loved, the man she had moved across the country for, the man she had diminished herself for. He looked like a stranger. He looked like a beautiful, well-crafted lie. "Is the meeting with the board, Zing?" Aria asked, her voice steady, devoid of the tremor that usually betrayed her nerves. "Or is it with Maya?" The silence that followed was heavy and jagged. Zane's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something, perhaps surprise or irritation, passing through them before his mask of iron returned. He didn't deny it. He didn't explain. He simply walked to the wardrobe and pulled out a fresh shirt. "Don't be tedious, Aria. I told you I have work to do. My life is too complicated enough without you inventing drama to fill your time." "I'm not inventing anything," Aria said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream. "I'm just finally seeing what's right in front of me." Zane paused as his hand was on a silk tie. He turned to look at her, his expression of bored condescension. "If you're going to have a tantrum, do it quietly. I have an early flight." He went back to his packing, dismissing her as if she were a mild inconvenience, a flickering light bulb he would deal with eventually. Aria didn't argue. She didn't throw the phone at him or demand to see the messages. She simply turned and walked out of the room. She went down to the kitchen, the marble floors cold beneath her bare feet, and picked up the landline. It was a secure line, one Zane rarely used. She dialed a number she had kept in the back of her mind for months, the personal line of a man who had been her father's most trusted legal advisor before his passing. A man who knew exactly how much the Balogun name was worth and exactly how much it cost to keep it clean. "Uncle," she said when the line connected. Her voice was like ice, cold and unbreakable. "It's Aria." "Aria, child? It's nearly 3 a.m. Is everything all right?" "No," she said, looking out at the manicured gardens of the estate, dark and silent under the Nigerian moon. Everything is finished. I need the best matrimonial lawyer in the country, and I need them to be ready by the time Zane's flight lands in Lagos tomorrow. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. Are you sure, Aria? The Baloguns, they aren't people you walk away from lightly. I'm not walking away lightly, Aria said, a small ghost-like smile touching her lips. I'm walking away with my life. Tell the lawyer I don't want his houses, his cars, or his billions. I just want the 2 years he stole from me. And since he can't give those back, I'll settle for his signature on a piece of paper. She hung up the phone. For the first time in 2 years, the mansion didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a departure lounge. She walked back upstairs, passing the room where Zane was likely already asleep, dreaming of mergers and old flames. She didn't go into their bedroom. She went to the guest wing, stepped into a room that smelled of nothing but fresh linen and silence, and closed the door. She didn't cry. She lay down on the bed, closed her eyes, and for the first time in 732 days, she slept with the absolute peace of a woman who was already gone. The smell of frying plantains and freshly ground coffee filled the sun-drenched kitchen, a warm, domestic aroma that felt like a lie. Aria moved with a rhythmic, almost hypnotic grace, her hands performing the tasks she had mastered over the last 2 years. She whisked the eggs until they were frothy, seasoned the spicy kidney sauce just the way Zane liked it, and arranged the plate with the meticulous precision of a woman who knew this was her final performance. She wore a simple white linen dress, her hair pulled back into a sleek low bun. She looked every bit the devoted Nigerian wife, a portrait of domestic serenity. But inside, the gears of a different life were already turning. Zane entered the kitchen at 7:15 a.m. sharp. He was dressed in a navy blue suit that screamed power, his presence immediately sucking the air out of the room. He didn't look at her. He went straight for the coffee carafe, pouring himself a cup with a steady hand. He was already on his phone, his thumb flying across the screen as he navigated the morning's corporate crises. "Breakfast is ready," Aria said softly. She placed the plate on the marble island, the golden brown plantains, the perfectly fluffy eggs, and the steaming sauce. It was a masterpiece of effort, a silent testament to the care she had poured into a man who never looked down long enough to see it. Zane glanced at the plate, then back at his phone. "I told you I'm in a hurry, Aria. I have a 9 a.m. in Lagos and the pilot is already at the hangar." "It's your favorite," she said, her voice devoid of its usual pleading edge. "Just a few bites." He sighed, a heavy, impatient sound that once had made her heart wither. He sat on the high stool, picking up the fork without ceremony. He took a bite of the eggs while his eyes remained fixed on a spreadsheet. He chewed mechanically, tasting nothing but the numbers on his screen. Aria stood on the other side of the island, leaning against the counter. She watched him. She watched the way his jaw tightened as he read an email. She watched the way he ignored the steam rising from the coffee she had brewed exactly to his preference. For 2 years, this view had been her world. She had lived for these fleeting minutes, hoping for a stray comment, a compliment, or a moment where he would set the phone down and truly see her. Today, as she watched him, she didn't feel the familiar ache of rejection. Instead, she felt a strange, light-headed sense of amusement. She found herself smiling, not the practiced, diplomatic smile of the Balogun wife, but a small, private curve of the lips that belonged only to her. Zane caught the movement out of his corner of the eye. He looked up, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What are you smiling at?" "Nothing," she said, her smile widening just a fraction. "I was just thinking about how much you enjoy your routine." "Routine is what builds empires," he snapped, taking another distracted bite before pushing the plate away, 3/4 of the food still untouched. He checked his watch, a different one than the vintage piece sitting in her nightstand, a gift he would never receive. "I don't have time for this. I'll be back on Friday. Make sure the guest list for the fundraiser is finalized by then. He stood up, grabbing his briefcase from the counter. He reached out and gave her shoulder a perfunctory pat, the kind of gesture one might give a loyal dog or a reliable appliance. It was the only physical contact they had shared in 48 hours, and it was as hollow as a drum. "Goodbye, Aria," he said, already turning toward the door, his mind halfway across the country. "Goodbye, Zane," she whispered. She watched his broad back as he walked out of the kitchen. She listened to the heavy thud of the front door and the receding growl of the SUV as it pulled out of the driveway. The silence that followed was different than the silence of the last 2 years. It wasn't empty, it was full of potential. Aria looked down at the discarded plate. The eggs were getting cold, the steam from the coffee had vanished, and the spicy sauce was beginning to congeal. It was the last meal she would ever cook for him. The last time she would stand in this kitchen, playing the role of the silent, supportive shadow. She picked up the plate and with a deliberate, slow motion, scraped the expensive food into the bin. She rinsed the plate, dried it, and placed it back in the cupboard. Every movement felt like she was shedding a layer of skin. She walked over to the kitchen window and looked out at the sprawling Abuja estate. The sun was high now, glinting off the fountain in the driveway. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was a woman with a manila envelope tucked in her bag and a lawyer waiting on the other end of a flight. Zane thought he was leaving for a business meeting. He had no idea that when he returned, the Ice Queen would be gone, and the only thing left in this mansion will be the echoes of a woman who had finally learned to love herself more than she loved him. Aria turned away from the window, grabbed her car keys, and walked out of the kitchen without looking back. She was smiling as she closed the door, and this time, the laughter was just a heartbeat away. The Lagos headquarters of Balogun Industries was a cathedral of glass and steel, soaring above the Victoria Island skyline. Aria stepped out of the elevator on the penthouse floor, the air smelling of expensive leather and the ozone of high-powered air conditioning. She didn't look like a woman in crisis. She looked like a woman on a mission. She had traded her soft linen for a tailored power suit in ivory, her heels clicking against the marble floor with a rhythmic, lethal precision. The receptionist, a young woman who had spent 2 years perfecting the art of managing the boss's wife, jumped to her feet. "Mrs. Balogun, I'm so sorry, but Mr. Balogun is in a closed-door session with the European investors. He was very clear about no interruptions." Aria didn't slow down. She offered the girl a small, serene smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I know exactly where he is, Temi. Don't worry, I won't be long." She pushed past the frosted glass doors of the executive wing. 2 security guards shifted, recognizing her face from 1,000 magazine covers, and hesitated just long enough for her to reach the double oak doors of the boardroom. She could hear Zane's voice from inside, deep, resonant, and vibrating with the absolute authority that had once made her feel safe. Now, it just sounded like the tolling of a bell. Aria gripped the brass handles and pushed. The scene inside was a tableau of corporate warfare. 12 men in dark suits sat around a table that looked like a slab of obsidian. Charts of projected billions glowed on the wall-mounted screens. At the head of the table, Zane stood with his sleeves rolled up, pointing at a map of West African trade routes. He looked every bit the conqueror. The room went silent as the doors swung open. Zane's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with a cold, jagged irritation that usually sent Aria into a flurry of apologies. "Aria?" His voice dropped to a dangerous octave. "What is the meaning of this? I told you this merger is the most important deal of the decade. We are in the middle of a vote." The foreign investors looked at one another confused, while the Nigerian board members looked at their shoes, sensing the impending storm. Aria didn't apologize. She didn't flush with shame. She walked into the room, her gaze fixed solely on Zane. She felt the weight of every silent dinner, every ignored text, and every cold night in that mansion as she crossed the plush carpet. She stopped directly beside him, the scent of her perfume, something soft and floral, clashing with the sharp, masculine scent of the boardroom. "I know it's important, Zane," she said, her voice clear and remarkably steady. "That's why I didn't want to wait another hour." She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. The paper was crisp, the weight of it feeling like the keys to a kingdom she was finally surrendering. She didn't throw it. She didn't make a scene. She placed it gently on the black marble table, right on top of the merger contract he was about to sign. "What is this?" Zane asked, his voice low, a warning growl meant only for her ears. He didn't touch the envelope. He looked at it as if it were a biohazard. "It's the one merger you didn't see coming," Aria replied. She looked him in the eye, and for the first time in 2 years, she didn't look away when he tried to intimidate her with his stare. "Consider it my contribution to your stressful day." Zane's hand moved, his long fingers tearing the seal of the envelope with an impatient flick. He pulled out the documents. As his eyes scanned the first page, Petition for Dissolution of Marriage, the blood seemed to drain from his face, leaving him a mask of pale, frozen shock. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. One of the German investors leant forward, squinting at the bold lettering. Zane's grip on the paper tightened until his knuckles went white, the edges of the legal document crinkling under his strength. "Aria," Zane whispered, a sound that was half command and half gasp. "Not here, not now." "There is no better place than here, Zane," she echoed off the glass walls. "You've spent 2 years treating our marriage like a business arrangement. I thought I'd return the favor. My lawyers have already filed the digital copies. You'll find I've asked for nothing but my maiden name back." She turned to the board members, nodding politely as if she had just finished a routine presentation. "Gentlemen, please continue. I wouldn't want to be a distraction from your empire building." She turned back to Zane. He was staring at her as if she had suddenly grown wings and flown, as if he was seeing a woman he didn't recognize, even though she was the only one who had truly known him. For the first time, the Ice King looked vulnerable, his mouth slightly parted, his legendary composure shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. "Goodbye, Zane," she said. She turned and walked out. She didn't run. She didn't look back to see him drop the papers or hear the frantic whispering of the board members as the deal of the decade was overshadowed by the collapse of his private life. As the elevator doors closed on the penthouse floor, Aria felt a sudden, sharp intake of air, a breath that reached the very bottom of her lungs. The paper grenade had been thrown, the boardroom was in ruins, and as she stepped out into the humid, chaotic heat of Lagos, she realized that for the first time in 2 years, she wasn't cold anymore. The silence that followed the click of the boardroom doors was heavier than any corporate tension Zane had ever navigated. He stood at the head of the obsidian table, the petition for dissolution of marriage still clutched in his hand. The crisp legal bond paper felt like a sheet of ice against his palms. Around him, the most powerful men in the Nigerian financial sector sat like statues, their eyes darting between the abandoned merger contract and the man whose personal life had just detonated in front of them. Zane's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, irregular beat that he couldn't control. He stared at the bold black ink of Aria's signature. It was elegant and final, devoid of the hesitant loops she used to make when she was unsure. This was a signature of a woman who had weighed her options and found him wanting. Zane, the lead German investor, ventured, his voice cautious, as if speaking to a wounded predator. Perhaps we should adjourn for the afternoon?" Zane didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat felt as though it had been lined with glass. He looked at the empty chair where Aria had stood only moments before. The faint scent of her perfume, the one he had never bothered to name, still lingered in the air, a ghost of her presence that mocked the sterile, masculine scent of the office. For 2 years, he had operated on the assumption that Aria was a fixed point in his universe. She was the one who was always there, the silent support system he could ignore while he conquered the world. He had built his empire on the stability of her presence, never realizing that he was standing on a foundation he had spent every day eroding. "Mr. Balogun," his chief legal officer whispered, leaning in, "if this is a joke, it is in very poor taste. If it is not, we need to contain the press immediately."
Zane finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot and blazing with a mixture of shock and a burgeoning, terrifying rage. "It's not a joke," he rasped, his voice sounding foreign even to his own ears. He looked at the document again. He had expected a business proposal. He had expected her to ask for a budget increase for her art or perhaps a donation to a charity. He had prepared a mental script to dismiss her requests with his usual cold efficiency. But there were no requests here. There were no demands for alimony, no claims on the Balogun properties, and no fight for the billions he had spent his life accumulating. She just wanted out. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the solar plexus. She wasn't negotiating, she was retreating. She had looked him in the eye and walked away from a life that thousands of women would have killed for, and she had done it without a single tremor in her voice. Zane suddenly felt the walls of the boardroom closing in. The expensive grey marble, the panoramic view of the Atlantic, the digital screens displaying his projected wealth. It all felt like a set piece for a play that had just been cancelled. He felt an irrational urge to run after her, to grab her by the arm and demand to know how she dared to do this in my house of power. But he remained rooted to the spot. His pride, the very thing that had kept him cold for 2 years, was currently a shackle. "The meeting is over," Zane said, his voice regaining some of its steel, though the edges were jagged. "But the signature, Zane? The merger is at stake," a board member stammered. "I said the meeting is over," Zane roared, the sound echoing off the glass walls. He didn't wait for them to gather their things. He turned his back on the men, the money, and the deal of the decade. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at the streets of Victoria Island. Somewhere down there, in the chaotic, humid heart of the city, Aria was moving away from him. He pictured her walking with her head held high, the wind catching her ivory suit, her eyes finally free of the sadness he had put there. He looked at the signature again. Aria Balogun. She had said she only wanted her maiden name back. She was shedding him like a winter coat in the Lagos heat. A coldness began to spread through his chest, not the calculated indifference he was famous for, but a hollow, aching frost. For 2 years, he had been the one who didn't care. He had been the one who dictated the distance. Now, for the first time, he realized that distance wasn't a tool he could use. It was a chasm she had just jumped across. Zane Balogun, the man who owned everything, stood in his glass tower and realized he was holding nothing but a piece of paper. The silence in the boardroom was no longer respectful. It was an accusation. He had spent 2 years ignoring her, convinced she would always be in the shadows. He had finally looked into the shadows, only to find that the light had left, and he was the one who was truly alone in the dark. The drive back to the Abuja mansion was the longest of Zane's life. Even the heavy, humid air of the capital felt thin, as if the oxygen were being sucked out of the atmosphere. He had ignored the dozens of frantic calls from his board of directors and the buzzing of his phone with news alerts about the Balogun boardroom scandal. His mind was a singular, obsessive loop of Aria's face, not the weeping, pleading face he had grown accustomed to, but the one from the boardroom, porcelain hard and terrifyingly calm. When his SUV pulled into the sweeping driveway, the house stood like a silent sentinel against the twilight. Usually, the lights would be warm, the scent of jasmine and home-cooked spices drifting toward the entrance. Tonight, the mansion was a monolith of shadow. He pushed through the front doors, the heavy oak thudding behind him with an echo that seemed to travel forever. "Aria?" he called out, his voice sounding hollow, as if he was shouting into a canyon. No one answered. He walked into the grand foyer, his footsteps sharp on the marble. He went straight to the kitchen, expecting to see her. Perhaps it had all been a nightmare, a high-stakes bluff to get his attention. But the kitchen was clinical. The island where she had served him breakfast just hours ago was scrubbed clean. There was no scent of coffee, no lingering warmth from the stove. The bin in the corner held the remains of the meal she had made for him, discarded like trash. A frantic cold sweat broke across his brow. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He threw open the doors to the master suite. The room was half dead. Aria's side of the walk-in wardrobe was a gaping white wound. The rows of designer dresses he had bought to ensure she looked the part of a billionaire's wife was still there, hanging like colorful corpses. She hadn't taken a single thing he had paid for. But the spaces where her personal things had been, her worn-in jeans she wore when he thought he wasn't looking, her favorite oversized sweaters, and the old leather bag she'd had since university, those spots were empty. He moved to the vanity. Her perfumes were gone. The air, which usually carried the soft floral note of her presence, now smelt of nothing but lemon-scented cleaning fluid and dust. He opened the jewelry box. The Balogun diamonds, the emeralds, and the heavy gold set his mother had insisted on were all there, mocking him with their glitter. But her small wooden jewelry box, the one that held a cheap beaded bracelet her father had given her, was gone. She hadn't just left him, she had erased herself from his life. Zane wandered back into the main bedroom, his legs feeling heavy. He sat on the edge of the bed, the side she usually occupied. He reached out to touch her pillow, hoping to find a lingering trace of her, but it was cold and perfectly fluffed. The cold treatment he had perfected for 2 years had finally been reflected back at him, and it was freezing. Suddenly, he remembered the basement. He remembered her mention of her art. He practically ran down the stairs, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He threw open the basement door and flicked the switch. The yellow light illuminated the space, but the corner where she had kept her hidden treasures was bare. The grey industrial sheets lay crumpled on the floor like discarded skins. The canvases, the vibrant, pulsing hearts of her soul that he had never bothered to look at, were gone. All that remained was a single smudge of cobalt blue paint on the concrete floor and a heavy layer of dust that had been disturbed by a frantic departure. Zane stood in the center of the basement, the silence of the house pressing in from all sides. For 2 years, he had complained that the mansion was too busy, that Aria's presence was a distraction, and that he needed quiet to build his empire. Now, he had the quiet, and it was deafening. He walked back upstairs, his movements slow and robotic. He stood in the middle of the grand living room, looking at the soaring ceilings and the priceless art on the walls. Art he had chosen because it looked successful, not because it moved him. Without Aria's warmth to fill the gaps between the marble and the glass, the house felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum. It was a tomb built of gold, and he was the only thing left alive inside it. He looked at his phone. He wanted to call her. He wanted to scream at her for taking the light with her. He wanted to demand she come back and fill the silence she had left behind. But he realized with a sickening jolt that he didn't even know where she would go. He didn't know the names of her friends. He didn't know the address of her favorite gallery. He didn't know anything about the woman who lived in his shadow for 732 days. Zane slumped into a leather armchair, the same one he had sat in 100 times while ignoring her presence on the sofa. The house felt too big. The shadows seemed to stretch toward him, cold and grasping. He had spent 2 years treating her like she was invisible. Now that she truly was, he found that he couldn't see anything else. The Ice King sat in his dark palace, shivering in a silence of his own making, finally realizing that the only thing more terrifying than an unloved wife was an empty home. The apartment in Surulere was small, the kind of space Zane's walk-in closet could have swallowed twice over. The walls were humble off-white, peeling slightly at the corners, and the floorboards creaked with a rhythmic, lived-in groan that was miles away from the silent, clinical marble of the Balogun estate. But as Aria stood in the center of the living room, bathed in the golden, unfiltered glow of the afternoon sun, she felt a lightness in her chest that made the air taste like champagne. There were no servants here, No security details standing like stone statues outside her door. No mother-in-law to critique the placement of a vase or the timing of a meal. She had spent the morning at a local market, haggling over the price of a second-hand wooden table and a mismatched set of chairs. Her hands, once reserved for silk and diamonds, were now dusted with the honest grime of a city that didn't care about her last name. She had hauled the flat-pack furniture up 3 flights of stairs herself, her muscles aching in a way that felt like a victory. As the sun began to dip below the Lagos skyline, painting the room in hues of bruised purple and honey, Aria sat on her new floor. She hadn't even bought a sofa yet. She didn't want one. She wanted to feel the solid reality of the ground beneath her. In front of her sat a steaming bowl of instant noodles, topped with a single boiled egg and a dash of local pepper. It was a poor man's meal, something Zane would have looked at with a mixture of confusion and disgust. In the mansion, dinner was a 5-course performance of imported ingredients and suffocating etiquette. Tonight, dinner was plastic-wrapped and cost less than $1. She took a bite, the heat of the pepper dancing on her tongue. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She ate slowly, watching the shadows of the window frame stretch across the floorboards. In the mansion, she had been a billionaire's wife with a hollow heart, a woman who owned everything and possessed nothing. Here, surrounded by 4 walls she paid for with the small savings from her pre-marriage art sales, she felt like a mogul. She was the CEO of her own peace. She was the sole shareholder of her own joy. The new Aria didn't check the news. She didn't look at the viral clips of the boardroom scandal or the frantic messages from her former social circle. She had changed her SIM card before the plane touched down in Lagos, dropping her old life in a bin at the airport. She stood up and walked to her bedroom, where her canvases were propped against the wall. They weren't hidden in a basement anymore. They were the first thing she saw when she woke up and the last thing she saw before she slept. She picked up a charcoal stick, her fingers staining black. She didn't wait for inspiration. She simply let her hand move. The lines were jagged, raw, and full of life. She wasn't painting for a gala or a corporate lobby. She was painting for the girl who had been silenced for 732 days. As the evening deepened into a warm, humid night, Aria didn't turn on the air conditioner. She didn't have one yet. She opened the window and let the sound of the street rush in. She had the distant thrum of a generator, the honking of yellow Danfo buses, and the laughter of neighbors sharing a joke on the balcony below. It was chaotic, loud, and messy. It was real. She leaned against the windowsill, the breeze ruffling the hem of her simple cotton shift. For 2 years, she had been a ghost haunting a palace of gold. She had been unloved, a status she had accepted like a life sentence. But as she looked out at the flickering lights of the city, she realized that the cold treatment had been a gift she hadn't understood at the time. It had frozen her, yes, but it had also preserved the core of who she was until she was strong enough to break the ice herself. She went back to her noodles, now slightly cold, but still perfect. She didn't need the Balogun billions to feel rich. She had her name back. She had her art back. And most importantly, she had the silence. Not the heavy, judgmental silence of Zane's neglect, but the quiet, expectant silence of a blank canvas. Aria laid down on her thin mattress that night, the scent of the city and the salt from the nearby lagoon drifting through the window. She didn't miss the silk sheets. She didn't miss the grey marble. She closed her eyes, and for a very long time, she didn't just sleep. She dreamt in color. The Penthouse Club in Victoria Island was a riot of strobe lights, pounding Afrobeats and the clinking of gold-labeled champagne bottles. It was the natural habitat of the Ice King, a world where money bought silence and power bought anything else. Zane sat in the center of the VIP section, the velvet cushions beneath him worth a small fortune, surrounded by a circle of Lagos's most ambitious socialites and business sycophants. "To the merger!" one of his associates shouted, raising a glass of crystal clear vodka. "And to freedom, Zane! No more checking the clock, eh?" Zane raised his glass, his jaw set in a hard, defiant line. "To freedom," he echoed. The words felt like ash in his mouth. He told himself he was relieved. For 2 years, he had treated Aria like an obligation, a soft, fragile thing that required a level of emotional maintenance he simply didn't have the currency for. He told himself that the boardroom stunt had been her final act of theatricality, and now that the distraction was gone, he could finally ascend to the height of his power without the anchor of a wife who wanted more than he could give. Beside him, a woman in a shimmering silver dress leaned in close. Her hair was a waterfall of bone-straight extensions, and her perfume was a heavy, aggressive musk that fought for dominance over the scent of the expensive cigars. She placed a hand on his thigh, a bold, practiced move, and laughed at something he hadn't even heard. "You've been too quiet tonight, Zane," she purred, her eyes bright with the reflected neon of the club. "Usually, the Ice King is a better conversationalist when he's willing." Zane looked at her, and for a fleeting second, his mind performed a cruel trick. He didn't see the silver dress or the calculated smile. He looked for the quiet poise of a woman who wore midnight blue silk. He looked for the depth in a pair of eyes that didn't want his stock options, but his time. He looked for the quiet dignity that had occupied his peripheral vision for 730 days. The woman who had sat at his table and offered him peace, only to be met with ice. He pulled his leg away, the movement sharp and involuntary. The woman blinked, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second before she smoothed it over with a practiced pout. Every woman in the room felt like a loud, bright imitation. The socialites were too eager, their laughter too high-pitched, their presence too demanding. He found himself cataloguing their flaws in comparison to the ghosts he had left behind in Abuja. They lacked the stillness of Aria. They lacked the way she could command a room without saying a single word. They lacked the scent of vanilla and oil paint that used to linger in the hallway of his home, a scent he once complained was unprofessional. "I need some air," Zane muttered, standing up abruptly so that he knocked over a crystal flute of champagne. He didn't wait for a response. He pushed through the crowd, his broad shoulders cutting a path through the writhing bodies on the dance floor. The heat in the club was stifling, the bass of the music thumping against his temples like a migraine. He burst out onto the balcony, the humid Lagos night air hitting him like a physical weight. Below him, the city was a tapestry of flickering lights and grinding traffic. He looked out toward the Atlantic, his hands gripping the iron railing until his knuckles turned white. "I am glad she's gone," he whispered to himself, a mantra against the rising tide of a feeling he didn't want to name. She was a weight. She was a distraction. She was never part of the plan. But the lie wouldn't stick. The denial was a thin veil, and the Lagos wind was tearing holes in it. He remembered the way the mansion felt that afternoon, the gaping holes in the wardrobe, the empty spaces on the walls where her soul had once been displayed. He realized that the quiet he had demanded for 2 years wasn't silence at all. It was a vacuum. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over her contact name. He wanted to call her just to tell her how much fun he was having. He wanted to tell her that the club was full of beautiful women who actually appreciated his presence. He wanted to prove to her that he was still the king of his own world. But he knew, with a sickening jolt of clarity, that Aria wouldn't care. She was somewhere in this city, or perhaps another, finally breathing air that didn't belong to him. She had walked out of that boardroom with her head held higher than he had ever seen it, and in that moment, she had become the one with the power. Zane looked back at the glass doors of the club. Through the tinted windows, he could see the shimmering silver dress and the golden bottles. It looked like a hollow, brightly lit cage. He didn't go back inside. He walked toward the elevators, his heart feeling like a lead weight in his chest. For 2 years, he had been the Ice King, the man who felt nothing and conquered everything. But as he stood alone in the elevator, descending toward the dark, chaotic streets, the first crack appeared in the marble. He wasn't glad she was gone. He was terrified of the silence she had left him with. And for the first time in his life, Zane Balogun realized that a king without a queen isn't a ruler. He's just a man alone in a very large, very cold room. Aria has finally found her voice, but Zane is only just beginning to realize what he threw away. Now that the Ice King is starting to melt, do you think he deserves a second chance, or is it too little too late? Drop a comment below with your thoughts. Are you Team Aria or Team Zane?
Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you do not miss it when I drop the part 2.